Welcome everyone to the eve of New Year's Eve. Today we have an all-Russian intro, because today is not just the 100th anniversary of the birth of the USSR, it is also the 106th anniversary since the assassination of Grigory Rasputin. What's interesting about the assassination of this vile man is that the assassin himself, Felix Yusupov, is the reason why nowadays you see disclaimers like these in your TV shows and movies. Why? Because a couple of decades after the assassination, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer produced this movie right here. And in this movie, they were inferring that the wife of Yusupov, Irina, was being seduced and taken by Rasputin, which led the family to sue Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, win a buttload of money in the lawsuit, and also cause every media since to have those types of disclaimers. So, with this Russian-themed intro over, today we have an interesting topic to talk about, a little bit too hot for me to show my camera for today. I don't want to be associated with what is about to follow. What is about to follow is talking about the numbers of the first couple of weeks of Dragonflight when it comes to players, when it comes to engagement levels of the content that's available at the start of this expansion, which is particularly curious, right? Because as far as I can see, at the very least, Dragonflight has been received very well, right? Most players seem to be, I would say, generally speaking, quite happy with the way the expansion has been going so far, right? What has struck me was the first bit of info I started looking into, and I started realizing once I started looking at things like these. What we are looking first is the number of players, the participation of players when it comes to the raid. So TLDR, how many players have been going inside Vault of the Incarnates in the first couple or so of resets of the raids since the season launched. What is interesting to point out before we start is that, of course, Vault of the Incarnates has the annoying release schedule, we can say, because the raid was released on December the 13th. When you go and look at the previous raids in the past 5 to 6 years, all of the other raids except for one were in pretty comfortable release schedules. For example, Sepulcher was on the 8th of March, Sanctum was on the 6th of July, you had Uldir on the 4th of September, you had Emerald Nightmare on the 20th of September. So basically we are talking about nothing really in the way of the raids being released. It was only Castornatria being on the 8th of December and Vault of the Incarnates being on the 13th of December, which were somewhat close to the holidays, the Christmas holidays, the New Year's, time off that people take, etc., etc. So those were the only two raids that might have changed the amount of players who participate in this content because of other real-life commitments and such. So looking at this, we can see that these are the numbers of Vault of the Incarnates in Heroic right before Christmas Eve. So in the first 11 to 12 days, depending on the region, these were the numbers of Vault of the Incarnates. Now, compare these to the release of the Raid of Sepulcher. These are the numbers. They are somewhat similar, even though we know Sepulcher was quite the challenging raid, quite the overtuned raid, definitely more so than Vault of the Incarnates. The numbers were still somewhat higher. The numbers continue to go higher the closer we get to the release of Shadowlands, because this was Sanctum of Domination compared to Vault of the Incarnates. Now the numbers are quite larger. We are in the 15-ish% more players inside Sanctum compared to Vault, and then we get the larger gap with the release of the expansion, the release of Shadowlands with Castornatria. As you can see, the numbers of Heroic Castornatria are somewhere in the 50% bigger than the numbers we have with Vault of the Incarnates. And it doesn't just stop here, because why don't we go back and look at the first raid of the expansion, not just for Shadowlands, but also for BFA and Legion, because this is BFA, this is Uldir. So Uldir is some 30% bigger than Castornatria, which is 50% bigger than Vault of the Incarnates. Same goes for Legion and for Emerald Nightmare. The number of guilds, the number of kills on heroic bosses in Emerald Nightmare are still quite quite larger, basically twice as many as the numbers we have right now in Vault of the Incarnates. So this is why I found it interesting, because from all angles, and also my own angle, to be fair, Dragonflight has been received positively. There is none of that ominous dark figure in the background of problematic systems which we knew since the beta players had been complaining about, that suddenly explode within the player base and started causing many problems to the players, like we had in Shadowlands. Now, when you compare this to the release of Dragonflight, we don't seem to have that much complaining about it, yet at the very least, once we start looking at the raid, the numbers are small, the numbers are tiny. There is no other way around it. You should have been blasting past the numbers of the last tier of Shadowlands, the last tier Sepulchre. You should have been much higher than that. You definitely would not have guessed that in the first couple of weeks of the release of the raid, you would have gotten the same amount of kills of Aranog, Terros, and the Primal Council than you have gotten of Vigilant Guardian, Skolex, and Artificer Zymox. Why? Because this is a new expansion. This is going to be the moment where you have the most amount of players. The most amount of players trying out the expansion, so it should be bound to have way more players than the tail end of an expansion like Sepulchre was for Shadowlands. So that is why it is quite interesting to see the numbers of the raid right now not being very good overall. Now, what if we look at Mythic Plus? Because I know what you might be saying. Well, I know why this is happening. Number one, there are the Christmas holidays. Number one, the raid has been released in a pretty uncomfortable and inconvenient time, especially for organized groups of players of 20 plus people. But Mythic Plus is much more easy to manage. It's much more easy to handle. It's easier for you to just pop in and out of a Mythic Plus key. So it's definitely easier to see way more players, way more representation in Mythic Plus than we see in the raid. There is also the fact that this expansion, Mythic Plus, has been significantly empowered in terms of how much gear, how much item level can you get from Mythic Plus. Not to mention, you can get things like the concentrated Primal Focus or the Primal Focus from Mythic Plus, so you can get your crafted gear. So Mythic Plus has even more of an incentive, not just the better gear, but also things like crafting that want you to go into Mythic Plus. That's why I think we have less players in the raid. It's definitely because there are more in Mythic Plus. Okay, we can test this theory. Since we are all scientists in here, let's go and prove our theory. Let's go and look at how Mythic Plus has been going since the release of the season. Obviously, looking at numbers of how many players have entered a Mythic Plus key in this first couple of weeks is quite difficult, of course, because it's hard to find numbers for the first couple of weeks of a patch of all of the previous expansions, right? So what we can see is where we are right now. So this is where we are right now in Dragonflight after a couple of weeks. We have roughly 2 million entries, 2 million individual entries in Mythic Plus so far. And, as I said, it doesn't tell us much, since these are the entries, for example, in Season 4 of Shadowlands. This is 2.4 million, and this was for roughly 3 months. This was from the start of August to the 26th of October. So it's quite good for Dragonflight to be almost at this number in just a couple of weeks, rather than 3 months, basically. You then have Season 3 of Shadowlands, which is from the start of March to the middle of August. So we are talking about 5 months and a half, and the number here is 4 million. Then you have another 5-ish months in Season 2, which is another 4 million number. We can even go back to look at Season 1 of BFA, which was another 5-month-long session of players, and it was at 4.7 million. So of course these numbers are hard to put in perspective of just a couple of weeks, right? We only have 2 weeks of this season, so that's what we can see there. What we can go and see, however, is a comparison like this one, which are all of the Mythic Plus runs completed in 1 week. Now, obviously, this doesn't take into account individual characters, individual players, which means there are going to be multiple players running multiple Mythic Plus keys, of course, but we can get somewhat of a picture compared to Shadowlands. The first week of Dragonflight was very similar, slightly above the first week of Mythic Plus of Shadowlands. And now the second week, this last tyrannical week, was lower by quite a bit than the second week of Shadowlands. However, in here, I don't even feel like taking copium. I feel like this is somewhat explainable by the fact that second week of Dragonflight was a terrible, tyrannical, into grievous, into bursting week, and that second week was running through Christmas. So I think it's quite expected and understandable if that second week had a pretty significant drop compared to the second week of Shadowlands. Now, all in all, these numbers, unlike the ones from the raid, we can say these are kind of good. They are good because don't forget, for how much you might have disliked Shadowlands, or at the very least how Shadowlands progressed, we do have as a fact that the release of Shadowlands was the best-selling PC game of all time. Blizzard even went on to boast about the fact that the first quarter, the first part of Shadowlands, saw higher subscriber number, higher monthly active users for WoW, higher than the peak of Worlds of Draenor. The peak of Worlds of Draenor was 12 million players. You know, that was right before the debacle of the 12 million players of Warlords dropping all the way down to 4.5 million, and that's when Blizzard stopped talking about subscriber numbers. But before that, we did know it got to 12 million. The release of Shadowlands did slightly better than that. Those were Blizzard's own words. So the numbers at the release of Shadowlands were very, very good. So seeing that we have more interaction in Mythic Plus than the first week of Shadowlands is a pretty good indicator of the engagement of the players when it comes to Dragonflight and to Mythic Plus. If it can match up to the numbers of the first week of Shadowlands, hoping of course that it won't have the same fate that the Shadowlands expansion had when it comes to player retention, when it comes to players being happy with the state of the expansion. So I guess the question at the end of this list of numbers is, are these numbers quite disappointing when it comes to the raid and still somewhat of a question mark when it comes to Mythic Plus? At the very least, not a blowout massive improvement compared to previous expansions. When you compare this to the massive blowout improvements to the previous expansions that we have seen from players' comments, from players' first reactions, from players shilling about how good Dragonflight is, call it however you want. Do you see this as something surprising, or do you see this as something expected, that we have, at the very least up to now, quite the significantly lower interaction of the players with the raiding part of the game? Is it because there are actually much less players than expected in Dragonflight? Is it because it has to do with the release schedule of the raid being quite inconvenient to many players, crossing through the Christmas and end of the year holidays? Is it because Blizzard has done a great job giving players many other things to do outside of the raid? Many players are now able to chill in the open world, to chill with profession, with renown grinding, with other things like Mythic Plus being much more important compared to previous expansions, for example? Or is it just a very simple lower amount of players, for example? That is kind of the point of today's video as we end the year. I guess we're gonna end the year with a question mark about the current situation of the expansion. Of course, the data for these numbers is still quite too small to draw out any definitive conclusion, so obviously this is all just conjecture for now, but I thought it was interesting to, at the very least, entertain the thought of why exactly do we have numbers like these right now. That was the point of today as we approach the end of the year. Of course, please go ahead and make all of your New Year's wishes and your New Year's resolutions. We all know you are not going to keep any of those by the end of the first week of the new year, but it's the thought that counts. For today, also, we are going to think about leaving each other by starting first and thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the support, of course, and the contribution to the growth of this channel. You can still, don't worry, support in other ways, which are still completely free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Also, you can follow me on Twitter, that would help right over there. You can do so if you want to get notified whenever I go live on my stream. I've been taking a week off since the start of the holidays as I was busy with other things, including, as you might have noticed, continued making videos, but for the stream it was a little bit too busy in this week. But we are starting very soon, I believe tonight as our first stream right before going off for New Year's. We should be on. Also, of course, as mentioned, I am live streaming as well on Twitch from 10 PM Central European Time Zone, 1 PM Pacific and 4 PM Eastern US time zones as well. So if you ever want to check out on stream, if you ever want to come up and do some keys and watch me deplete one key after the next, you are welcome to join whenever I am live. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, now me and the weather still have to have that talk, the talk where we say it's December, it's Christmas, it's cold, where is the snow? Yeah, that talk is long overdue.